Welcome to another Steelers Retrospective by Steeler Nation. Recently, the NFL announced the 2021 Pro Football Hall of Fame class, and two longest-serving Steelers were elected, Alan Faneca and Bill Nunn. In this retrospective, we're going to take a look back at the legendary career of the sports writer who became a scout, who became an executive, and helped craft football's greatest dynasty, blazed the trail for others to follow, and ultimately attained immortality as he earned his way into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. The story starts back in the mid-1960s under former Pittsburgh Steelers head coach Buddy Parker, who came up with the idea for a scouting combine. Under Parker's direction, he established a multi-team scouting collaborative known as BLESTO, an acronym for Bears, Lions, Eagles, Steelers Talent Organization. The combine allowed member clubs to scout college talent across the nation while sharing the expense four ways. He first resisted the idea, but Bill Nunn joined BLESTO on a part-time trial basis in 1967. And who was Bill Nunn? He was a sports editor for the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the country's largest African-American newspapers. He focused his attention on black colleges in the South like Grambling and Prairie View and Florida A&M, where he discovered amazing talent such as Deacon Jones. For years he had covered and reported on black college players overlooked by the NFL scouts and sports writers for America's major newspapers. Nunn annually picked a black All-America team for what is now known as the Historical Black Colleges and Universities, or HBCU, most of them in the South, and held a banquet for them in Pittsburgh. When the Steelers first formed as the Pirates in 1933, they didn't exactly systematically scout or recruit African American players, but that was among many other reasons for the Steelers' 50 years of futility, as they relied on newspaper clippings, letters from a part-time scout / part-time undertaker named Ray Byrne, utilized 3x5 cards with notes, followed All-America lists, and limited their scouting to the big universities, which at that time were predominantly white. So they seldom saw black players. This trend started to change in 1967. Dan Rooney began reading Bill Nunn's column in the Courier and was especially interested in his annual Black College All-America team. Why didn't we know about these guys, he thought. A reporter from the Courier named Rick Roberts used to hang around the Steelers' offices at the time, so Rooney asked him to find out why Bill Nunn never came around. Nunn's reply was pretty simple. He wasn't coming down to the Steelers' offices because he did not like the way the Steelers did business. In response, Rooney called the Courier and personally asked Nunn if he would come meet with him to talk. Nunn hesitated at first, then agreed to meet. Rooney opened up the conversation to ask, "How come we never see you down here?" Nunn replied in a very terse and very stern voice, "There have been many times I felt like coming to the press box and different things. That because I was from a black newspaper, I wasn't particularly welcome. Plus, I turn out an All-America football team every year, and nobody from the Steelers has ever contacted me. I've heard from the Los Angeles Rams about Dan Towler. I've heard from the New York Giants about Roosevelt Brown. To tell you the truth, nobody from the Steelers has ever called me, and I don't think you're ever going to be a winner." "Well, why don't you join us? Work for us," said Dan Rooney. "I already got a job," Nunn said. "Well, work for us part-time. Look at the games. Take notes on the players. Send us reports. Tell us what you think." In retrospect, Nunn was probably surprised that he was even called. He may have thought the Steelers were deliberately excluding black players, but the truth was, they didn't know them, did not know how to scout, did not know how good they were. So when Bill Nunn had joined the Steelers, he gave them an advantage that no other team had. Joe Gilliam, John Stallworth, Mel Blount, Ernie Holmes, Chuck Hinton, Ben McGee, Donnie Shell, Jack McLaren, Willie McClung, Frank Lewis, Sam Davis, Dwight White, Glenn Edwards. All or most appeared on Bill's Black All-America team. He had a great eye for talent, and not just at the small schools. He became a trusted advisor to Chuck Noll, the Chief, Art Rooney, and to Dan Rooney, as well as a confidant to the players. And working in the Steelers front office, he became the first African American executive on any NFL team. In 1969, Chuck Noll took over as the Steelers head coach the same year that Bill Nunn joined the team full time. And Chuck Noll had a mantra: to win a game, you must first not lose it. Everything depended on the draft, and he wanted to build it through the defense first. And Noll was hired less than 24 hours before that first draft, and he had his eye on the guy he wanted. Joe Green. This went against the popular opinion of the fans at the time, and even a lot of the Steelers scouts in Blustow, who had their eye on a local favorite, Notre Dame quarterback, Terry Hanratty, who they, by the way, were able to get in the second round. In the meantime, Joe Green became the cornerstone of the franchise, and a destiny was born. To this day, Joe Green is only the second Steeler to ever have his jersey retired, but Chuck Noll still didn't even have any business cards when he drafted Joe Green, so he was going to need help. So who did he turn to? Bill Nunn. Because Bill Nunn saw his vision, and he made a recommendation: a defensive end in the 10th round by the name of L.C. Greenwood. 2 years later, in 1971, on the advice of Bill Nunn, Dwight White from East Texas State was drafted in the 4th round. And then in the 8th round, Ernie Holmes from Texas Southern, and thus born the Steel Curtain, the original Steel Curtain, the greatest defensive line of all time. Chuck Noll and Bill Nunn became very close and had a great relationship, although they didn't always agree. In particularly, a story from 1970 and a player by the name of Mel Blount. They both agreed he was great. In fact, he was definitely on Nunn's All-American team, but they disagreed on whether or not Blount was a safety or cornerback. Nunn worried whether or not the 6'4" Blount would be quick enough to cover deep, but after poring over hours of game tape, Noll correctly predicted that Blount could use his size to bump receivers at the line, disrupt their patterns, cover them deep, and Nunn would agree because, by his own admission, he had not taken into consideration how physical Blount would be on the bump and run, but there was never a dispute about drafting the talent. In 1972, the Steelers made a commitment to filling a need at running back. Nunn had scouted out Robert Newhouse, and he initially thought he would fit the Steelers system best. But ultimately, after a discussion, there was no doubt that Franco Harris was going to be the Steelers' #1 pick. Harris won over Nunn the first time that he put on a Steeler uniform, and Nunn could be quoted later to saying, "The thing that impressed me most about Franco was that coming out of Penn State, he wasn't the #1 back, but he showed a willingness to work. That first day of practice, he ran everything the goal line, and he had those quick feet. In 1974, the Steelers draft made history. Bill Nunn, Chuck Noll, Dick Haley, and Art Rooney did their homework, and they had a strategy. But even Dan Rooney would be the first to admit they had a little bit of luck in that process. In that greatest draft of history, they drafted Lynn Swann, Jack Lambert, John Stallworth, and Mike Webster. The only time 4 players were from a draft that went to the Hall of Fame. The 1974 Steelers rookie class also included Donnie Shell as an undrafted free agent who would become one of the best defensive backs in franchise history, and he earned his induction in the 2020 Hall of Fame class, also scheduled to be inducted in 2021. The irony was that Bill Nunn wasn't even scouting Shell when he went to a South Carolina game, as he was going there to scout someone else. But he saw something special in the undersized linebacker that made him believe in his ability that he would become a great safety. And just to sweeten the deal, the Steelers also signed another undrafted free agent, Randy Grossman, to round out one heck of a great rookie class in 1974. Looking at those Hall of Famers, Chuck Noll really wanted to draft John Stallworth, but Nunn convinced Noll that Lynn Swann was the right choice. Not only was Swann an amazing, acrobatic wide receiver they believed could outrun or outjump any defensive back matched up against him, but strategically, Nunn knew that teams were already aware of him, and because he was from USC, the Steelers would never get another shot at him. Noll really wanted to take Stallworth, and he had to get talked out of it in the second round. Art Rooney Jr. watched Jack Lambert practice at Kent State when they left the muddy field and practiced on the gravel and pavement, and watched as he went full speed, tackling guys to the ground and just picking out pieces of gravel right out of his elbows and knees calmly in the huddle. It was the mindset and work ethic the Steelers are built around. In a rare move, the Steelers actually traded their 3rd round pick, and much to Noll's relief, Stallworth was available in the 4th round, just as Nunn had predicted. Perhaps the only franchise in professional sports with a greater selection of centers are the Pittsburgh Penguins with Mario Lemieux, Ron Francis, Sidney Crosby, and Evgeny Malkin. But when it comes to centers in the NFL, no NFL team can match the Steelers. And they found the best of the bunch in Mike Webster. But Nunn's magnum opus was unquestionably how he maneuvered the Steelers into acquiring Stallworth. He brought back the excellent reports on the wide receiver. And he convinced Chuck Noll to wait until the 4th round to get him because he knew no other team had scouted him as thoroughly. But that was only part of his pièce de résistance. As was custom then, Nunn traveled with Blesto scouts as they swung through the South. But on the practice track, when evaluating Stallworth on that day, it had rained and the track was wet. So Stallworth's 40-yard dash time was not as impressive as it could have been. Nunn's intuition told him there was something special about him, though. So the next day, he faked it. Faked having a bout of the flu. Told the other Blesto scouts to go on without him. And when they left, he didn't waste a minute. Got Stallworth on a dry track, put him through his paces, and got good times on him. Much better than those recorded by the Blesto guys the day before. Nunn then convinced legendary A&M coach Luis Cruz to give him the Blesto film on Stallworth to take back to Pittsburgh. So yet another Nunn relationship paid off big for the Steelers. Somehow that tape got lost and never made it to the other clubs as it was intended to. As back in those days, they didn't have the technology that exists now. There was just one tape and it was supposed to be shared where everybody once you looked at the film. Well, whether that was deliberate or just a fortunate foul up, no one will ever say. Maybe no one knows. But that Steelers, the stalwart of Steelers mystique, added one more touch of destiny at the Senior Bowl. The college all-star game that's attended by droves of NFL scouts. When the coaches there decided to play stalwart at defensive back instead of wide receiver, nobody got a look at what he could do catching the ball. Steeler Nation is thrilled with those coaches' decisions, while the Dallas Cowboys, not so much. At first, not everybody saw the brilliance of the 1974 draft. According to Dan Rooney, the Post-Gazette offered this opinion. The Steelers seemed to have come out of the first 5 rounds of this draft appreciably strengthened at wide receiver, but nowhere else. They didn't get a tight end, and the ones remaining are more suspect than prospect. They didn't get a punter, although none of the nation's best collegiate kickers went in the first 5 rounds. They didn't get an offensive tackle. That might have shored up what could well become a weakness. What they did get was Swan, who seems to be a sure pop-up to help. But Lambert figures to be a number 5 linebacker if he even pans out. And there's 3 other question marks. Just something to consider when the talking heads start breaking down the 2021 draft. After all, what the heck do sports writers know about the NFL draft anyway? Well, unless their name is Bill Nunn. The 1974 Steelers won Super Bowl IX, and that roster had 11 players that appeared only on Bill Nunn's All-America team list. Nunn's contributions to the Steelers opened their eyes to a wealth of talent that helped him turn the franchise to a dominant force in the 1970s, and it's a huge reason why he can stand by 4 Lombardi trophies. He was a trailblazer who would certainly be a general manager in the NFL today, a position the Steelers technically never even formally filled in 2010. Nunn worked for the Steelers for 46 years. As long as one of the longest tenured employees of the Steelers, he holds the distinction being one of the few with 6 Super Bowl rings. For 18 of those years, he served as the assistant personnel director until he officially retired in 1987, a retirement that kept him working as a senior scout for the Steelers for the next 26 years because he wanted to continue to do the job. While not hitting the road as he once did, he watched a lot of film and video and served as a cherished advisor to the team. Dan Rooney would recall in Super Bowl 30 how Nunn observed the Dallas Cowboys defensive players were bent over, hands on their knees, exhausted in Super Bowl 30 after the Steelers gained momentum and pulled within 3 points at 2017 in the 4th quarter. He said the Steelers just need to continue running the ball down their throat and they'll win. Nunn always did seem to have an insight that most others did not. But if you really want to get the best words from anybody, get it from the players' mouths themselves. From Mel Blount, you cannot write the history of the Pittsburgh Steelers without Bill Nunn. When you look at the Steelers of the 1970s, none of that would have happened without Bill Nunn. John Stallworth would say Bill Nunn paved the way for a lot of guys with the Steelers and other teams to have an opportunity to come in and show what they can do. It opened the door for a lot of guys that came after us. And Donnie Shell, Bill Nunn has done so much for the league over the years, not just for the Steelers, but also when he was a reporter, going to the HBCUs and letting the NFL teams know about that talent. For his decades of service, in 2010, Bill Nunn was enshrined as a member of the inaugural class for the Black College Football Hall of Fame. 2011, he was an inaugural member of the Pittsburgh Pro Football Hall of Fame. And finally, in 2014, when the Pro Football Hall of Fame changed their bylaws, in which they would now include a contributor defined as an individual who has, quote, made outstanding contributions to professional football in capacity other than player or coaching. Finally, in 2021, Bill Nunn became a finalist. And then, with a resume just too good to be ignored, the most overdue individual was posthumously selected, and Nunn became the first African American contributor in the first 100 years history of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Nunn worked until the rest of his life that spanned nearly 9 decades and probably provided enough stories to fill 9 books. He left an indelible imprint on the Steelers and is one of the most significant figures in this franchise storied history. Nunn passed on May 6, 2014, 2 weeks after suffering a stroke, and was buried at Homewood Cemetery in Pittsburgh. He was survived by his wife Frances, his daughter Linnell, 3 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. Bill Nunn died what he loved doing. Steelers general manager Kevin Colbert gathered his top scouts in the war room just days before the 2014 NFL Draft, and as they were amid their readings and coming over the details of individual prospects one by one, shortly after 9 a.m., he looked over and noticed that Bill Nunn looked like he had fallen asleep, that he had slumped over. The stroke he had suffered from would end his life 2 weeks later. He was 89. The Steelers, Pittsburgh, and the NFL lost a giant that day. In tribute to his service, Steeler Nation thanks Bill Nunn, and we are going to heartily celebrate his induction into the Pro Football Hall of Fame.